So in this last lesson, we're going to do something a little bit different and actually consider the impact on society of cryptography. At the end of this lesson, you'll be able to explain why use of cryptography presents society with a dilemma and to compare a number of different approaches to addressing that cryptography dilemma. So throughout our discussions of cryptography, we've been assuming, broadly speaking, that the sender and receiver who are exchanging encrypted traffic are good people, and they're encrypting their plain texts in order to prevent bad people from finding out some kind of information. Now, there are many situations in society where that is true, but there are many situations where maybe there are shades of grey involved in this. There are situations where people who are exchanging encrypted data may well be doing something which authorities wish to learn. For example, people investigating criminal activity, or for reasons of national security. And if we convert plaintext into ciphertext in such a way that that plaintext can never be recovered, then we're actually presenting a problem for criminal investigations, a problem for national security, because the information that's being exchanged cannot be accessed. Now, this problem has existed ever since cryptography started being used in any wide sense. But since 2013, when former National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden started informing the world about certain practices of intelligence agencies around the world, we've started to learn that the cryptography we've been using every day might not be as secure as we expect. Now, we don't wish to cast any judgment on what Edward Snowden did, or indeed of the morality of monitoring activities that are encrypted. What we actually want to do now is just look at ways in which cryptography could be undermined should that be felt necessary. And if you think about it, almost any technique for breaking a crypto system could be exploited to undermine the protection that cryptography offers. You could undermine the algorithm, you could undermine the implementation, or you could undermine somehow the key management. And in fact, if we reflect back in history, we'll see that almost all of these techniques have been used. And indeed, a way of controlling the use of cryptography in early commercial uses was in fact to make the algorithm not as strong as it would appear to be. Sometimes algorithms had what is known as backdoors, which made the algorithm not be as strong as it should be. And the designer who knew the backdoor could perhaps recover information, could recover a decryption key, recover plaintext. But the person using the algorithm would expect full protection from it. Another technique that was used last century by a number of countries around the world was to impose export controls on cryptographic technology. So this was a legal means of, in some sense, allowing strong encryption to be used within the borders of a country, but restrict the power of the encryption if that technology left that country. So a product could be built, strong encryption could be used within borders, but if that product was sold around the world, it would have weaker encryption. Now, placing a backdoor into an encryption algorithm or trying to restrict the movement of encryption across borders are actually viable techniques when cryptography is embedded in hardware devices. A hardware device has to leave a country and can be inspected at a border. If you're going to make an algorithm weak in some particular way, then it can be, if that's hidden away in hardware, maybe nobody will notice. But in the 1990s, we started to see cryptographic software appearing. Cryptography was much more commonly required in software. And neither of these techniques are very effective. Indeed, there was a dispute around the world very much about this control of cryptography, with a number of high-profile stunts pulled, including people printing cryptographic code on t-shirts and wandering through borders wearing their cryptography. Very hard to address. So the last sweeping attempt to moderate and control the use of cryptography in the late 1990s was an idea called key escrow. This was suggested by a number of governments around the world. And the basic idea was everybody can use strong encryption, that's fine, so long as a copy of the decryption keys that you use are registered with the government or some appropriate authority. They will look after them, and in the event of a criminal investigation or a national security incident, a court could request access to the decryption key, and ciphertext relating to that investigation could be decrypted. Now, this in principle seems like a good solution. But let's think about the way we use cryptography today. We use it on our bank cards, Wi-Fi, WhatsApp, all these applications. Every time you use cryptography, that system is somehow going to have to be integrated to this system that somehow securely stores copies of decryption keys. And any businessman will tell you that's going to be expensive. Any engineer will probably tell you, and it's probably not going to work. And indeed, chiaroscuro was opposed heavily, particularly by the commercial community, and it never actually came into force. So now let's look at the modern world we live in, with cryptography is used all the time. This is a complex world, many applications, many networks, lots of cryptography being used. Almost impossible somehow to control cryptography as it's used in all these different applications. Or is it? Is it easier or is it harder to control cryptography in this complex modern world? Well, in the complex modern world, it's certainly difficult to put some kind of blanket control that controls cryptography. Probably impossible. But within all the complexity of the modern network and the modern use of cryptography, there are many, many opportunities, arguably more opportunities than in the past, to somehow try and undermine cryptography, maybe in a messy way rather than in a nice, clean way. And in fact, what we've seen from the revelations of Edward Snowden and others is that there is some evidence that a huge variety of different techniques are used today to try and undermine cryptography. And let's just think about the kinds of things you could possibly do. For example, today, people's mobile phones are portable computers. All sorts of data exists on a mobile phone. How could one compromise a mobile phone and somehow get access to encrypted data? Well, one simple technique, and it's relatively simple, might be to persuade the user of the phone to download some code or download an app onto their phone, which in fact is a malicious app, which somehow looks for keys on their phone or looks for plaintext on their phone and reports it. Now, because users of mobile phones are not experts, then you may well be able to target somebody with such a piece of malware. But also the networks are complicated. Data goes through all sorts of servers by all sorts of routes. And anywhere on these networks, everywhere on these networks, keys are managed, keys are distributed, keys are stored. There are many places around these networks where decryption keys could be lurking, and sometimes plaintext is lurking. And any of these are places somebody could go, and if any one of these points is weak, that's a potential point at which a decryption key could leak or plaintext could be found. And if we even think about technologies are complicated. They involve vast supply chains. Different organizations in different countries supply different components. It would be possible to compromise a particular component coming from a particular outlet. That's a possible point of weakness because the systems are complicated. It's hard, for example, to get the keys of all the phones in use in the world. It might be possible to get the keys corresponding to a particular supplier who for some reason has either been compromised or decided to cooperate with an authority who wishes to access these keys. So the world is complicated, and in that complexity, there are many, many different opportunities. So in some sense, looking back on this, we have a dilemma. We will always have a dilemma, however our technology evolves. Use of cryptography will always present us with this dilemma. But as the world becomes more complicated, and as we use more and more technologies in different ways, then there are many places within the networks and computers and technologies we use where cryptography may do a good job, but could also be compromised. And that in its heart is the cryptographic dilemma, which is not going away anytime soon. So in summary, use of cryptography presents society with a dilemma. And that dilemma at its heart is really how to balance freedom and control in modern society.